We've been through this before. Welcome back. We appreciate you coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
Why don't you start and take just a few minutes to talk about why you are the best person to be the governor of South Carolina, and we'll have some questions to get into.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It is good to be back. I am on a very real mission to restore honest leadership and accountability to the governor's office, and to make sure that we have a governor that we can trust, and to make sure that we have a government that we can trust and is accountable. And I think that's what this election is about. If we look at what's happened over the last 4 years, there's a pretty stark difference between myself and Haley. If we believe in holding leaders and governors accountable, if we believe in the cabinet form of government that says we should hold governors and leaders accountable, then you need to look no further than what has happened in the administration under Governor Haley. We have spent the last year trying to raise the issue of what's occurring at her Department of Social Services. As you know, I've been a strong advocate for a strong governor's office that has a cabinet form. And that's because I believe the governor is responsible for her agencies. Our Department of Social Services has incredible problems. Governor Haley has either ignored or covered up those problems over the last year, and the results have been tragic. And if you think about a governor who controls an agency like the Department of Social Services, and the resistance to the inquiries made about the deaths of children, the harm to children that should have been prevented by this, and the resistance by this governor, I think it speaks volumes as to why we need honest leadership and accountability. If you think of the Department of Revenue, which is a cabinet agency that the governor controls, and you realize that we're the only state in America that had all of our tax information hacked into and stolen, and the governor's response was not being honest and accountable, but instead was to look at the TV cameras and say nothing could have been done when we all know that wasn't true, to fail to release the information that the public deserves to have, when the agency was run in an incredibly incompetent manner and dysfunctional manner. And then I think we have to say that we need honest leadership and accountability back in the governor's office and in our government. And you can look at other agencies throughout state government and see the same dysfunction. So I see my job and my job as the next governor as speaking the truth. And I think the truth needs to be heard now more than ever in South Carolina's government and governor's office. And then putting forth solutions that can solve those problems. And so that's what we've done in this campaign, and it's what I'll do as governor, and it's what I've done with DSS, where I have, for the last year, talked about the truth of the tragedies that have occurred, the failures and the cover-ups of Governor Haley, and then put forth solutions, like bringing back retired DSS workers to work part-time who are already trained to help ease the caseload, like requiring that all investigations begin within 24 hours, like increasing the number of folks at SLED with the Special Victims Unit, like restoring morale in that agency where DSS workers are afraid to speak the truth because they know the vindictiveness of the agency and the leadership and the governor, and making sure that we have whistleblower protections. And I think that the governor can do that in cabinet agencies themselves, and I think we should do that. Those are solutions, and when you have a governor who has not put forward solutions, who has instead covered things up, I think it cries out for restoring that honesty to the office. And there are big differences between me and Governor Haley in the way we approach government, the openness, but there are also very big policy distinctions. And I can talk about a few of those, or you can. Okay. So one of them obviously is in DSS, and we've put forward ways to fix DSS, and she's failed to do that, and instead chosen to cover things up there. But there are other big differences. In education, there's a dramatic difference. So for the last 4 years and longer, I've put forward ideas on how we could improve and reform public education. Governor Haley has failed to talk about public education until an election year. And everybody knows that when a politician just talks about something in an election year, what's going on. And the ideas we put forward are very different. We have a gimmick approach to public education in South Carolina, and Governor Haley's approach has been generally more of that. my approach is very much to focus on what I believe are the basics that can move us forward. And that means getting kids early, and that's why I've been such a strong proponent of 4-year-old kindergarten and taking it statewide. And I'm very proud to have helped lead the charge over the last 2 years to build up a coalition of Republicans and Democrats to begin that process. And when I'm governor, I want to complete it. It's why I believe that the focus should be in the classroom, and that means concentrating the limited dollars we have in the classroom. The easiest way to do that, the best way to do that, is again to focus on the basics. You know, Mom was a school teacher. That is what matters. So I proposed using our increased revenues over time to increase teacher pay. We are one of the lowest in the nation. We trail our neighbors, and I think that's where the focus should be. The focus should also be with those dollars when they increase in reducing class size. These are basic things that we can do that we know can improve the educational experience and the results. So you get the kids early, you focus on the classroom and empowering teachers, which is what I'm talking about. And then finally, we really put our backs toward having equity funding in public education. And I've talked about this for a decade, and I've put forth ideas and plans on how to achieve this with Republicans and Democrats. But at the end of the day, you need a governor to lead. And we haven't had a governor who led in quite a while. To tackle big ideas like that, you have to have a governor who is willing to put forward those ideas and push very hard to make it happen.
Let me interrupt you right there, and then you can come back to the other policy differences on public education. Clearly, you're right that she was silent for the first 3 years, but when she did speak up, it was on an issue that you and I and everybody else who thinks about this has been saying for years and years and years is the thing that we've got to deal with, and no other governor's done that, and clearly what she did only starts it, but that was a pretty huge step. I mean, do you disagree at all with what she did? And two, to sort of respond to that, I mean, it was late, but it hadn't been done before.
You know, I welcome her to supporting ideas that I've put out and others have put out in the past. I was thankful when she signed my government restructuring bill. That was the right thing to do, and I was proud that it occurred. And changing the weighted pupil formula to take into account poverty is a positive step forward. But if you take money from one pot and move it into another, the net result is not much. And what I've heard from superintendents as I travel around this state is that they feel like Governor Haley's proposal was simply a shell game. That you move money out of one pot, you put it in another, you say you did something, but the net result is that the monies that the districts have to spend on those children in their district really has not made a difference. So I would tell you I welcome this governor and any other elected official realizing there's a problem in the way we fund. But we need much more dramatic change, and we need real change to have a greater impact.
And one other thing before you go on to your next issue, you talked about using the growth of income to increase teacher salaries and to lower class sizes. You've also said you want to use the growth of income to improve infrastructure. There's only so much growth of income. I'm not seeing how the money adds up to get us where we want.
Well, we have limited tax dollars, and the question really is, where are your priorities?
Right.
So when I proposed expanding 4-year-old kindergarten 2 years ago, the question was, where do you get that? I think it was $27 million. And the answer to that was, you make it a priority. And when we had a budget increase of, don't hold me to this, but that year it was probably close to $500 million. Carving out that $27 million made sense. It set the priorities. We're not going to be able to accomplish everything in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years that we need to accomplish, but right now we're moving generally in the wrong direction, and I want us to move in the right direction. You set priorities and you move in that direction. And we'll talk about infrastructure, but there is new revenue that needs to be raised in infrastructure as well, and I've proposed ways to do that because we need to do it. I think there's also a pretty stark difference in one area where we could generate billions of dollars in revenue, and that is in Medicaid expansion. And I think that's a good example to address the different approaches and how we could utilize our own tax dollars to improve South Carolina. For example, because Governor Haley has refused to keep our Medicaid tax dollars in South Carolina. She has instead spent somewhere between, I believe it was $30 and $50 million of state tax dollars to try to buttress up rural health care. If we just accepted our Medicaid dollars into South Carolina, that would give us millions and millions and millions of dollars that we could use to raise teacher salaries, to shrink class sizes, to dedicate to the other needs of South Carolina. I think, and when I talk to people and I listen to them about Haley's refusal to accept our Medicaid tax dollars, to keep our own tax money in the state, I am frankly left with only one conclusion, and that is that it is just wrong for her to do that. It is just partisan for her to keep our Medicaid tax dollars, and frankly, it is incredibly stupid. It is wrong for South Carolina and for our citizens. Look, at this point, she is sending $11 billion of our own tax dollars to other states. We are all paying those tax dollars. We are all on the hook for any debt that is nationally, and they ought to come here. We know it will create 45,000 new jobs, good paying jobs. We know that it would help probably close to 300,000 South Carolinians. We know that right now, rural hospitals are in crisis because indigent care dollars have been cut, and Haley refuses to accept our Medicaid dollars here to help fund their operations. And that means that right now in Chesterfield County, the hospital is slated to close April 15th. In Marlborough County, the hospital is slated to close in 2015. Union has gone bankrupt. Other states, other hospitals around the state are in serious crisis, all because Governor Haley refuses to accept our Medicaid dollars into the state. And that is wrong, morally wrong. And when I'm governor, I believe that we will bring our Medicaid dollars here. We'll keep them. And that is a huge injection of jobs, of revenue, and of common sense back into South Carolina. So that's another area that we have a pretty stark disagreement. I think we have a real disagreement on the best economic model for South Carolina. So for the last 3 years, we've seen declining incomes in our state, in our families in our state. We have seen a record number of people drop out of the workforce. We continue to see young people leave the state all too often. And we were rated recently as the 5th worst economy in America. Why? It's because we have a 40-year-old economic development model. Now, we need to recruit out-of-state corporations to open offices here and employ people. But if that's all we're doing, we're going to continue to see our wealth decline in South Carolina and our incomes decline. States that are successful have a robust small business and entrepreneurial economy. They have an economy that supports their own businesses, that helps their own businesses succeed. They have a tax structure that's friendly to small business and local business. They have a Department of Commerce that helps small business and local business. Think about it this way. If a South Carolina business creates jobs, those jobs are very likely to stay for dozens and dozens of years because the people who own the company live in that community and they want it to be successful and stay there. Think about it this way. If an owner of a business lives in South Carolina and they make profits, those profits are going to stay in South Carolina. They're going to be donated to charities. They're going to be reinvested in the community. They're going to be spent in the local stores, and that is how you grow wealth. So as governor, I want to not only recruit big out-of-state corporations to open offices here, but I also want to support small, locally owned businesses. And that means, for example, that we address the very real problem of commercial property tax that under Act 388 is a growing and continuing problem. And I've got lots of anecdotes about where that's hurt the economy. It also means that we re-gear our Department of Commerce so that not only do we recruit businesses, but we have a division of entrepreneurship and small business. And I have heard from literally dozens and scores of small businesses about their terrible experiences with state government and their problems succeeding in South Carolina. But as Division of Small Business and Entrepreneurship could help small businesses find capital, which is a big problem in South Carolina because we're capital poor. It could help with business plan development. It helped communities create clusters of small businesses and focuses just like we try to do with big businesses in South Carolina. And it could help navigate the very real problems that small businesses experience with the bureaucracy and the red tape of South Carolina government, which I've heard over and over and over again. And we need to change that mindset, and we need to change the mindset of the leaders in South Carolina that we can be successful with local business and keeping wealth in the state.
job, there's a huge difference between job announcements and actual jobs. But there has been, the governor seems to have had good success in bringing in more jobs, to the extent that the governor can be credited with that, and all governors get either the credit or the blame. Do you agree that that she has improved the economy, that she has brought in a good number of jobs, and that it's, and you just want to do more and focus a little differently, or do you take issue with the argument that there have been there's a lot of new jobs? I mean, clearly, yes, our workforce, people have dropped out of the workforce, but the workforce is larger and more people are employed.
So I think that Haley's continual announcements of jobs, which we know from the reporting done at this newspaper and others, are oftentimes jobs that never come or leave, shows how out of touch she is with what's actually going on in South Carolina. No, I don't think that South Carolina's economy is doing well under Governor Haley. It is not. To have declining incomes for families for 3 years straight tells you what the reality is in South Carolina, and I think it shows how out of touch Governor Haley is with the reality that I experience as I travel around the state and talk with people. For her to say that things are going great in the economy of South Carolina, they demonstrably are not. The national economic picture has turned around, and we've seen unemployment drop across the country. I believe that our unemployment rate in South Carolina is higher than the national average. I have to check to see what it is today. But it is actually artificially low compared to what in reality it is, because we've had so many people drop out of the workforce. We have had a higher percentage of people drop out of the workforce in South Carolina than the rest of the country. So the reality out there is Haley can announce jobs all day long, but they don't come quite frequently. And also, we lose jobs in South Carolina very frequently, and I don't see Governor Haley admitting that very often. We've had some big losses in the state as well as some big wins. And look, it's great when we have job growth in the state. I supported the incentive package for Boeing to come here. I thought it was important enough to show up and vote on it. Governor Haley didn't. I bet she counts those numbers in her job numbers. I supported the incentive package for companies in South Carolina that we've brought to this state. I think it's important to do that. I supported Amazon's incentive package when Governor Haley opposed it, said she didn't support it. I bet she counts those jobs in the job created numbers too. So I think that my job and the public's job is to look at the reality of the job situation in South Carolina. And the starkest number there that reflects reality is that we've seen declining family incomes under this government. We have to turn that around if we're going to be successful.
Is that something you can send me the data on the declining incomes in the schools?
Absolutely.
So there are there are many things that we disagree about. I've released a road plan in a book I wrote a while ago, and also this summer. Governor Haley says she's got a secret plan. She's going to tell everybody in January. I look forward to looking at her plan when I'm governor and seeing if there's any merit to it, but that's not leadership. Leadership is putting forth ideas that you think advance the goals of the state, and then sitting people down around the table who have other ideas, and then working out what the solution will be and making it happen. And that's what we're doing. We know, I believe there's 3 things that need to happen to fix the infrastructure of South Carolina. Number 1 is we now have 2 policy-making bodies. We have 2 funding bodies for roads. We have the Highway Department, the Department of Transportation. We also have the State Infrastructure Bank. I propose combining the governance of those into one entity so we can save money, so we can have coherent policy. I've also proposed in the past, and as part of this race, that we have a fix-it-first policy, which means the great bulk of the dollars that are generated for roads should go into existing roadways to repair them. Go out on rural South Carolina where I live, and they are downright dangerous. Get on the interstates and go on 95 and come up from Georgia where it's 6 lanes and it's smooth and traffic flows, and you hit South Carolina and it's an embarrassment. And Governor Haley has not done anything in 4 years to remedy that. I've put forth ideas ranging from an upfront infusion of over $1 billion in bonds that we could use to begin to repair the roadways that we have, to raising revenues that would go into a better governed system, including tolling roads, which many states do. When we do major construction like widening I-95, we ought to consider tolling that. It will generate millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of revenues. And states from West Virginia to other states across this country have used that source of revenue to improve their infrastructure. We should look at the other ways that we generate revenue to see if there are other opportunities, so we'll have a more balanced system instead of being totally reliant on the gas tax as we have for too long, which is ultimately a declining source of revenue. I've also talked in this campaign, and I think it's really important that we have leaders who lead on issues. And there are two that come to mind that I think are important because they speak about the ability to lead the state in a different direction. One is domestic violence. I released a plan months ago on ways that we could try to tackle what is a very real issue in the state. I believe we've been first and second in women killed by men that they know over the last 2 years. It's an awful, awful statistic, and it's an awful reality. Several years ago, Governor Haley vetoed funding for our domestic violence shelters. I was proud to help fight against that and overturn that veto. That's a real difference, but it's also a symbolic difference in recognizing and lifting up this as a real problem in the state. I think the other area that is important for projecting leadership and setting an image relates to state employees in our state government. When Governor Haley was elected, she pretty much immediately increased the salaries of some of her staff dramatically in years when other state employees were either seeing decreases or cuts. Around that same time, we also saw an increase in the state legislature's budget, while other state agencies were receiving cuts. I thought that was wrong, and so I worked with a Republican legislator to enunciate that, to put forth a proviso or a measure that would have said we shouldn't do that it's important that leaders lead, and when the rest of state government is being cut or employees are seeing flat salaries, that we shouldn't, we should set an example that we will live in that same way. I think that's been missing from the governor's office. I think we need it back. It's not a huge dollar items, but it's important to symbolically lead the state by saying that we should not give governor's office employees dramatic pay raises while others are receiving dramatic pay cuts. There's a lot to do, and I've worked hard over the last 4 years and more to have real solutions. And I think that's a pretty different approach than what the current governor's record is. You know, I fought for years to restructure state government, and we now have the most powerful governor's office in the history of the state of South Carolina. But it hasn't been used in a way that will move the state forward. And to have good government, you need good leaders and you need good structure. We have a better structure. We can still make it better. We have a better structure than we've ever had, and yet our agencies fail over and over again. And yet we have a governor who covers things up over and over again. We need to have a leader who's responsible, accountable, and honest if we're ever going to change that. And that's why I'm running for governor.
One of the, 4 years ago there was, I know we were very concerned. In fact, one of the big differences to us between the two candidates was that we had every confidence in the world that you would be able to work with the legislature, and very worried that that would not happen. And I think that Governor Haley got off to a bad start, but I think, and please tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, I think that she has done a lot better and has not been the disaster that I expected her to be. Is that a fair assessment? And if I'm wrong, and if it's not, then tell me why I'm wrong.
I think that if you look at some of the major contentious issues that come before the legislature, and I'll just use a couple, I think that Governor Haley oftentimes was a hurdle to overcome that successfully was overcome in some instances and was not. I'll use government restructuring as an example. Government restructuring passed, and I'm thankful it passed, but oftentimes those of us who were supporting it in the legislature had to try to deflect away from the governor because she was offending people in the legislature or politicizing it to such a degree that it made it harder to pass than easier to pass. We were successful in that. I'm thankful that we were successful in that, but it was oftentimes difficult because of the governor's involvement that caused other people to not want it to pass. I think we would have passed ethics reform in the last year in a real and meaningful way, not in a just fake way, if the governor had not attempted to use ethics reform as a way to cover up her own ethics failures in the past and to deflect the fact that she had been involved in basically a whitewash in the House Ethics Committee. I think that legislators knew that. I think that it often caused friction and it made it much more difficult to advance ethics reform, which I think we'll be able to pass fairly easily with a different governor. And I think that if you look at DSS, it's also illustrative. Here we have kids who are literally being harmed, when in many instances there should have been greater intervention by the Department of Social Services that likely could have resulted in a different outcome. When you had legislators begin to inquire, frankly, I wish the inquiries had started much earlier, but when they finally began to inquire, the governor's office was hostile to it, resistant to it, providing misleading figures, and that is a real problem. Because your government only works if you have strong executive leadership that's open and honest, and then you have legislative oversight that can shine light on the failures of the executive. And having a governor who sandbags that is a real problem, and it causes real friction between the bodies.
What else would you like to do in terms of the structure of the government? What other changes do you think will hold?
So, as a passionate advocate for public education, I think accountability in education is critical. I don't believe we have it in South Carolina. If you think about it, we have several governing entities that address public education, and it's confusing to the voters, it's confusing to officials, and it's certainly confusing to educators. It tends to cut teachers out of having input, and when you have a leadership that doesn't value public education, it's worse. So right now we have a superintendent of education, we have a education oversight committee, we have a school board, a state school board, and you have a governor. And they all have influence, either structurally or through the power of the bully pulpit to affect public education. We need to appoint the Secretary of Education, a Secretary of Education, so that when people go and vote for a governor, they know that one of the most important functions of state government is going to either be changed or improved or not as a result of that vote. So I would appoint the Superintendent of Education. I think we ought to do that, and I've supported that for many years. I also think we need to abolish positions that don't need to exist. There are ways to save money in state government, and our current administration surely has not done that. We ought to get rid of the Secretary of State's office. We don't need it. Those minimal functions could be given to other state entities. The same is true of the Comptroller General's office. What we've tended to do is to diffuse power, although we have consolidated more than ever with the governor's office. Now, that being said, if we don't hold governors accountable for their failures in elections, then we'll have worse government when we do this. And that's why this election is so critical. In a way, it's a test of the cabinet form of government. If it's okay for DSS to be a disaster under a governor and she's reelected, then accountability doesn't work. If it's okay for a Department of Revenue to allow 3.5 million of us to have our information stolen, or a governor to cover it up, not be honest with people, allow that dysfunction to have existed, and she gets reelected and the cabinet system does not work. It's important that accountability exists in the cabinet form of government.
talk a little bit about tax policy, because that's something that you have worked on a good bit in the past. I'm not sure you can talk as much about that. It's a little boring, but
it's a Cindy Scoppy topic.
That's right, it is. How much are you going to push for tax reform?
If at the end of 4 years we have not enacted some substantial tax reform, I will consider it to have been a failure. We have not had real tax reform in a generation or more. The system has tended to be made worse, not better. And as governor, I'm going to help lead the charge to make it happen. It doesn't mean I have all the answers, but I think we have discussed previously parameters that I believe it needs to fall within. Big problems right now are the incredible load on the commercial property owner, small business owner.
Right.
We need to reduce that. I'll tell you a very quick story. I have a supporter that owns hundreds of millions of dollars of apartment complexes throughout the Southeast, owns several here. He met with me. He said, I tried to talk to the governor. She wouldn't listen. I tried to talk to other leaders. They wouldn't listen. I'm never building again in South Carolina because the rates here are so out of whack compared to other states. I sat down and looked at his books. So here you have economic activity that would have been generated, jobs that would have been generated, but they're not going to be because our property tax system is way out of whack. It also manifests itself with the industrial property tax rate, which is the highest in the country. And that means that big out-of-state corporations might get fee in lieu of taxes, but South Carolina companies just get hit. And that tends to lessen our economic growth and the wealth of South Carolina. So those are two places that we certainly need to look. I've also believe that ties into education funding, and that we need to move more toward a state-funded system of education where you can have a rational tax system across the state that also helps lift up kids in rural parts of South Carolina. So those are the primary focuses that I would be looking at and hoping that we would have reform. And as a part of that, we have to look at sales tax exemptions. And there are many. In my book, I propose some that we should look at to see if we can change or eliminate to make the system fair.
Oh, I know. The governor very famously and very clearly has said she will veto any and all tax increases. Tell me where you are on taxes.
I don't believe that we need to increase tax rates, but I believe that everybody should bring their ideas to the table. And my job as a candidate is to say that these are my positions. I don't think we need to raise tax rates, but I welcome everybody to the debate, and we can have a discussion about it. And at the end of the day, I think that my plans are the best. My plans to fund roads, my plans to support public education, but I want to welcome everybody. So I'm not making veto threats before I'm elected. I'm saying that all ideas are welcome, but my ideas don't include increase in tax rates.
And how do you look at that? Do you see South Carolina having all the revenue that it needs to do the things that need to be done and to shore up areas that fell off during the recession?
I'd answer that one in two ways. One is that setting priorities matter, and oftentimes the priorities are not correct under Governor Haley. So denying our Medicaid dollars is clearly a wrong priority that would generate billions of dollars in revenue that could be used for South Carolina. So that's, I think, answer number one. And I think answer number two, though, is the problem in South Carolina's revenue generally is not the rates, it is the stability. So, for example, with the sales tax exemption, I would never support increasing the sales tax. But there are ways to make sure that the sales tax is more stable. Are all the exemptions that exist, do they make sense? Does it make sense to tax mobile homes one way but manufactured homes another way? And I can't think of all the provisions right now, but there are many provisions that we need to look at to see if we can build stability into that system. And I support looking at those and trying to make changes where appropriate. I don't know how you read that. That's the tiniest type of verse in my life.
It is tiny, and the problem is, it's stuff that I I know your answers by heart, so it sort of seems stupid to ask some of these questions that we usually ask. Warren, what all do you have that we haven't talked about? Because like half of my interview is stuff that we know is answers.
Well, good question about.
Yeah, you mentioned one measure. If you're elected, tell me in 4 years how we would grade your administration a success.
That's a great question. Number one, you would grade my administration's success by saying that Governor Sheheen brought honest leadership and accountability back to a government that needs it now more than ever, into a governor's office that desperately needs it. I think that's the most important thing that will happen after I've been governor for 4 years. That we will have a confidence in what has been a scandal-marred governor's office in government. Number two, you will see the acceptance of $11 billion in Medicaid dollars that help rural hospitals and 300,000 South Carolinians, and that creates 45,000 new jobs. Number three, I would like for us to see full day 4-year-old kindergarten, certainly for all at-risk kids, but also begin universal 4-year-old kindergarten to be phased in over time. I believe that we would need to see some substantial tax reform in South Carolina that makes us much more attractive to small business growth and development. And I would want to have seen us issue $1 billion worth of bonds to begin fixing our roads and dedicate increased revenue towards fixing our infrastructure. And I could go on and on and on, but I'll stop there. There's no point in running for governor if real, big, substantial change is not going to occur. And I believe that the state is ready. I believe the state is hungry. I believe the state is desperate for leadership and for real change moving forward. And that's what I hear when I travel around.
If the economy isn't doing that well under Governor Haley, why is the business community supporting her?
Well, I would say the business community is not supporting her.
Okay.
There are hundreds of small businesses across South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
There are groups who have been incredibly supportive of me. She might have the political insiders, some of the political insiders in Columbia, but you know what? The status quo tends to support the status quo.
Let's get back to DSS for a moment, and because that's a huge part
Yes.
of your argument that she's an incompetent governor. A lot of the news reporting has said that, there's a lot of debate over what the real numbers are, but there are some indications that perhaps there's not that many more kids dying than there were before she came into office. And the DSS is doing no worse than it was. Is that, in your mind, incorrect, or does that not matter? Or?
It is absolutely incorrect.
Okay.
And Haley's assertions that DSS is doing okay are just an absolute dishonest attempt to protect her reelection bid, and kids are really suffering. Look, when 17 calls don't bring DSS action and a kid dies, it is badly broken. I've talked to enough Department of Social Services employees confidentially and people who have left to know that an agency that was not in great shape when Haley took office has been practically destroyed over the last 4 years. And the results are terrible and they are horrifying. And the only entity that I know that claims the numbers aren't worse is the Department of Social Services and Nikki Haley. Any outside groups who evaluate what's going on, any former employees that I've heard of will tell you that it is much worse. Look, there's dishonesty in in the Department of Administration and in Governor Haley's office, and it manifests itself in the claims of people moving from benefits to work from the Department of Social Services to claims that only 6 months or a year ago Governor Haley was saying about how wonderful the Department of Social Services was doing. It is not. And I would encourage you to talk to people who were there and left, or that will tell you. The other thing that is most troubling to me is the fear in the employees when they speak, and they will only speak anonymously because they fear what will happen to them. I met with a former employee a week ago who reported misconduct in the agency, and she told me that she was essentially isolated and eventually forced out by the way they treated her. She left because of the treatment of her. And that's one in many.
What would be your approach to filling agency head positions in the cabinet?
Generally, you mean?
Yes.
So my approach would be to look for the best qualified person and to be personally involved in the process. I think that's one of the things that's been missing. I've heard, look, Haley's had a revolving door administration where these agency heads come and go, and I think that is partly due to a lack of her personal engagement in government. You know, you need a governor who's actually governing. Look, the number one job of being a governor is governing, and we haven't had that. So I would be personally involved in it, Warren. I would be looking for the best and the brightest. I think that it's very important we have a diverse administration. I believe that we should look for talent within South Carolina. I believe we should also look outside of South Carolina, but I want there to be a priority on also looking within South Carolina for talent to lift up. You know, this is a little bit off the subject, Warren, but I think it's worth mentioning. We right now send millions of tax dollars outside the state to private vendors that do programs within South Carolina. I really want to have a South Carolina focus on, you know, our agency heads, but also the companies that do business with the state. We are sending multi-millions of dollars out of state. That is South Carolina tax money being sucked outside the state to other states and companies there. So, got me a little bit off the subject, but agency heads is important that they're diverse. It is important that that we look for South Carolina talent, that they have real experience. I value frontline experience. I think it's important, and that they're qualified to do the job. And those are the criteria I'll really be utilizing.
Jamie, did you or Andy have questions you wanted to ask?
They get to drill me all the time.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to give them a shot.
We had some things we wanted to ask you about after.
Okay.
What else do you have, Lauren? Tell us what we haven't talked about.
I don't think the only other thing I would say that we haven't talked about is the need to have a leader who puts the good of the state above partisanship, above future political careers. And I think that one of the most important things for the next governor to be able to do is to work with members of both parties. You know, South Carolina has a great history of being highly successful when you have a government that reflects all perspectives. I think of Carol Campbell with a Democratic House and Senate. And I think that my work over the last 10 years to build relationships with both Republicans and Democrats has led to some of our greatest advancements in South Carolina over the last 10 years. I think back to enacting the Conservation Land Bank when I worked with Chip Campson, who played such a critical role. I think to government restructuring, where I worked with Shane Massey and others in the South Carolina Senate. I think to tax reform, where we at least advanced the debate, if not reached the goal, when I worked with Rick Quinn, who at that time I think was the Republican majority leader in the House. I think of my work with Paul Campbell, a Republican, to help with the Surface Water Withdrawal Act, which will help to protect rivers and streams across South Carolina. So I think the one of the things that we really need in the governor's office right now is somebody that brings people together instead of divides them. We've been divided for way, way too long.
Talk to the, what do you say to the voters, many, many, many of whom are either Republican or almost always vote Republican, who just feel like, you know, what he says sounds okay, but, you know, I know he's a Democrat, and I don't trust Democrats, and he's going to raise my taxes, and I just don't like Democrats, and I certainly don't like the president. How are you reassuring those people?
I talk to them the same way I talk to independents and Democrats, and I think that's important. And that is, look at my record. I've been willing to stand up to Democrats. I've been willing to stand up to Republicans when I believe they're wrong. And I've been willing to work with both parties when I believe they're right. And when I ask folks, what's more important, the person or the party? Almost always they tell me the person. Almost always they tell me the person. So look at the track records of the two candidates, or the 5 candidates. Look at the track records of the candidates and see who has been there to, whose actions speak, and also their words, and which candidates tend to talk more than they act. And I think at the end of the day, enough people respond to that to be successful. We all know how close the last election was in a very interesting year nationally. And I think we all know this race is going to be very, very close at the end of the day.
Speaking of standing up to Democrats, there have been occasions, one that comes to mind is in restructuring a couple of years ago, when legislation that certainly you have a strong history of supporting and that I believe you support, came down to cloture votes, and you voted with the Democrats to prevent votes that would have allowed legislation to pass restructuring. And I think there were some times like that with the ethics legislation. That doesn't feel like standing up to your own party to me. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I think that it's important on very big issues that we have consensus when we move forward, and that generally the result of that consensus is better legislation. I think that was true with government restructuring. There was a proposed compromise that came at the last minute of a session, and the question was whether we were going to shut off people's rights to debate that. And I chose to let people continue to discuss it, because generally having something pop up at the last minute that's very complicated and is major change in the state is not the best way to proceed. And true enough, the next year I pushed to pass government restructuring, and the result was a better piece of legislation that created a more empowered governor's office. And I think that's the way I operate, and I think that's important. That's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. That is saying that if we are going to have major change in South Carolina, we need to bring people together to achieve it, not be divided. And when we do things in a very divided manner, the results tend not to be good.
Now you feel like the governor. I can imagine that the Democrats will be looking to you as being the head of the Democratic Party, and there'll be certain expectations. How do you balance all that you just talked about with governing and then responding to the expectations of your party?
I think parties are at their best when they are open and honest about what we can achieve, and that means setting priorities. And so I think my job as governor and any involvement with parties is to speak the truth and say these should be our priorities, and then rally people around them. And I think that's what my role would be. And we've discussed the priorities that you would judge me by, and I think that my job as a governor and also as an elected official who belongs to a party is to bring with me the support to enact those changes. And to do that, you have to engage with people in your party, but also people in the other party. I think that's what a good leader does. I think that's what my job will be. Good.
Else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, my
Thank you.
pleasure. It's good to be back with you.
Yeah.
Glad you're here. Glad I'm here.
Yeah.